Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Welcome back to Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson.
Once again, we will be taking a tour around the garden and the hedgerows of myth in order to nail some untruths and root out some others. And I'm using that metaphor because this week I'm going to be mostly talking about root vegetables.
Root vegetables, how exciting.
What are you going to be talking about, John?
I'm going to be talking about feral children, i.e. not children who are just wild and kind of run around intimidating adults, but those who, it was believed at least, had been raised by animals.
That's right, and it's hi from me, AI Joe. This week, you will be eating your vegetables and finding your inner wild child as John and Otto discover whether animals have ever raised children and if carrots help you see in the dark. Otto's question for John goes back to the foundation of Rome and the story of Romulus and Remus, who were reputed to have been raised by wolves. Is there any evidence of humans having been raised by animals?
Tell me about feral children.
Let's put this out there. Honestly, there isn't really any evidence that human beings...
Nice and bollocks.
But let's talk, because it's an interesting subject, which is why is it that we are so fascinated? There are some very, very famous cases. The very famous case of Peter, the wild boy of Aveyron, Caspar Hauser, and often they're discovered by people. In the case of Peter, the wild boy of Aveyron, he was discovered by people who are out hunting in the Aveyron in France. It's what happens next that's the interesting stuff. They have clearly been living outside, apparently on their own for some time. To that extent, they are feral because they don't speak. They don't speak any kind of language. There are some other really famous stories as well from India. But the thing that we want to believe, I mean, Romulus and Remus,
Mowgli.
Also Tarzan, supposedly raised by apes. Although in the actual books, apparently Burroughs was really cross that actually, I don't know how this works, but he discovered he was an aristocrat. If you remember the Christophe Lambert film where he plays...
Never forgotten.
Greystoke. He learnt from his parents' books that were left behind with him. Not quite sure how that works, but anyway, that was the idea. And Burroughs was always very cross that he didn't, the idea when the film came out that Tarzan, I think Johnny Weissmuller said, he spoke in the kind of language that you'd use to talk down to a 2-year-old. What didn't he say in the film, Otto? He did. The famous palindromic call, which is a completely different... That's a red herring. He never said, me Tarzan, you Jane.
Oh, yes. Was Johnny Weissmuller famous... he was an Olympic swimmer, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Was he German or Austrian born, or was he American?
My understanding was that I think he was Austrian born.
Because I'm wondering whether there is a sort of editorial, directorial decision, plus they're in a jungle setting, that sound quality presumably wasn't brilliant in early 1930s. You couldn't exactly run around with a mic. Well, I wonder if they kept the script to the minimum so that he could run around without revealing he had a thick German accent.
I don't know what happened to Weissmuller for the rest of his career. I mean, he was definitely a swimmer, and he definitely swam for America. He didn't swim for Austria. The whole idea of how that call, the famous palindrome, an oral palindrome, if you listen to it, it peaks and then it repeats itself in kind of symmetrical shape. We can all do it probably if we still remember it. But getting back to the real subject here, which is the wild children. What is it about this idea that's so appealing? What happened with Victor, the 19th century one, and before that, as I said, there was the wild boy of Hanover and Caspar Hauser, who famously appears out of nowhere and can't remember anything. In the case of Victor, he clearly had been abandoned in the woods. He had a terrible gash to his neck. So the thought is that he was probably left there to die and didn't die. And, there is some evidence. There was in Uganda, I think in the 90s, there was a feral child in Uganda in 1991 called John Sabunya, who he had seemed to live with a pack of vervet monkeys, although he wasn't there for terribly long. But obviously he had learnt to forage food by watching them. And years later, this is going to be the real point of this story, he was able to make that transition back into human culture and became a singer in a choir, but he still apparently was able to communicate with monkeys. Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, became the pupil of a man called Jean-Luc Itard, who was a theorist about language. And this is kind of, we're going to talk about this.
Yeah.
We always talk about Hobbes and Rousseau. The idea that if you strip away all the layers of civilization, you get to the essential goodness of the human person, the wild,
primitivism,
the noble savage.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things that drove this story. We wanted to believe but actually what happened was that Victor couldn't really communicate, couldn't speak, didn't have any of the phatic communication skills that the normal development of a human child would have. And that's why Itard became fascinated, because he was interested in language acquisition and teaching. So he invented a really extraordinary collection of flashcards, which he'd put on objects and worked very, very hard to develop Victor's skills, and didn't really kind of kick in. I mean, he got to a certain stage. Isn't there always, a really extraordinary woman in the story called Madame Guérin, who looked after Victor when the doctor wasn't doing his thing. And he did bond with her. There's a very moving scene in Truffaut's film, which was based on Itard's journals, called L'Enfant Sauvage, where he sets the place out for the husband who has died, and she cries, and he comforts her, Victor comforts her, and never sets the place again. So he has learnt to some extent how to communicate emotionally. He just doesn't, without getting into linguistics, Otto, he had passed the period, it's called a critical period for language acquisition. And if you don't get any stuff going in, you never really learn to acquire it properly, or you certainly don't learn to acquire it fluently.
So what age is he at this point?
So he was I think they found he was about 9 years old.
Right.
So it's astonishing that he survived for as long as he did, and nobody really knows the story. But the idea of him living, as it were, as a full-blown wolf, probably not true. He probably learned by watching animals to forage.
Why do you think we're attracted to this? Because I don't know why. It weirdly reminds me of that very peculiar story from a few years ago of the man who was found on a beach in Kent, bedraggled and wet in his suit, who apparently couldn't speak, who they then put in front of a piano and, according to the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror and other tabloid journals of the time, started to play beautiful and evocative music, but nobody could get through to him. Do you remember this story?
Yeah,
he was called
remember.
the Piano Man or something like that. And then it turned out that he was just a guy who'd sort of done a runner from home.
Yeah.
You do wonder whether sometimes these sort of extraordinary stories are people. Not the one you were just talking about with Enfant Sauvage, which sounds like an eau de cologne, doesn't it? To go a bit Alan Partridge.
To be fair.
Yeah. You do wonder whether people latch onto these stories because they sort of feed our fantasies of what we are and who we are. And sort of, there's a narrative drive to them almost, isn't there?
Yeah. It's also that I think that people feel, we've talked about animal language and communication before, that there is some kind of, people sometimes do feel genuine emotional connection with animals. And there is a sort of, I suppose, a belief you could kind of see how a primate or a wolf might build a relationship with a small human child. It's none of the evidence, unfortunately, really stacks up. And as I say, what's I think interesting is that there is a point, round about 3 years old, where you need to have contact with other humans in order for your language faculties in your brain to develop properly. I mean, some really famous cases too of Jeannie, who's a horribly distressing case of a girl who'd been locked in a room by her father. For hours, just all day, every day. And she was noticed when she went into hospital, was in the 1960s, as that she was not walking properly and wasn't making any eye contact. And she became a very famous test case for what I suppose is that idea of the critical period where you, in order for your genetic inheritance, your brain and your actual brain to start gelling together. So like with Victor, Jeannie got to be able to do, she could name things and she learnt how to do, but she could never really speak in the normal way. And Victor was the same. He could point to things, he could dress himself, bathe, he could do simple commands, but he was never able. And of course, Itard he went through puberty and became very violent and difficult. And Itard left him with Madame Guérin, and nobody knows how he died when he was about 40.
Another
happy
story
joyous,
from history. Another joyous episode in history.
We've always got Tarzan.
What happened to the chimpanzee? What were the chimpanzees? Well, I know what happened to one of them. What was Tarzan's chimpanzee companion?
Cheetah.
Cheetah.
Cheetah was a film star, yeah.
Yeah, but there were more than one.
Yeah.
There was more than one cheetah. But one of them, I think, was still alive, at least up until about a decade ago, and developed some sort of artistic skill. And I seem to remember that Peter Blake, the British pop artist, put on a show alongside Cheetah. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Cheetah also wrote an autobiography, and I'm desperately trying to remember who it was that actually ghostwrote. But it was brilliant because he was
Johnny Weissmuller, my part in his downfall.
Well, it was he'd seen Hollywood at its peak.
I don't think it really was by him.
No.
Though, John. It was the ultimate ghost-written biography.
But I think the Tarzan story is obviously, whether you believe it as a piece of narrative or not, there is a sort of part of you that wants to believe that Tarzan is the good guy, that he's up against, he's always up against hunters.
Yes.
And all of that thing of being able to understand. I mean,
how many hunters were there? Also, the entire setup of that jungle was very peculiar. Didn't it have tigers alongside lions with sort of giraffes, and it was a jungle as devised by someone who had never gone out of Wisconsin.
The books, I don't know if you've ever tried to read the Tarzan books. Gore Vidal said that he thought that he was untroubled by any ability to reproduce accurately human speech, but he could do action really, really well. So you don't read it for the start.
Drawings were quite good.
I think it's part of this idea. I mean, it is a bit noble savagey, but maybe it's more to do with the fact that we are increasingly interested in lost skills that hunter-gatherer peoples can read landscape. They have skills that we've lost. I think we were talking about, us outsourcing a lot of our tracking skills to dogs when we domesticated dogs. And I think there is a continuous sort of belief now that the more we observe nature, the weirder and more extraordinary it becomes. And that it's not just about the natural world is there for us to turn to our own uses. But I think that's why those stories kind of never go away.
And I think that leads us neatly onto root vegetables.
Yeah, of course.
To remind you human animals, lest you forget what you are, suckers, Otto's question this week is there any evidence humans have been raised by other species of animals? Well now, computing may be binary, but its conclusions aren't. There are documented cases of feral children who grew up isolated from humans and spent time with animals. However, the evidence for animals truly raising them is thin. While there are real stories of children surviving with animals, true raising by them in the way we think of human parenting is unlikely.
Excellent.
Excellent work.
Yeah. Well done, AI Joe.
I think we're on the same page, AI Joe. At long last, it's taken us 11 episodes, but finally I sort of feel we're in alignment.
And the conclusion is twaddle. John's question for Otto this week is a real eye-opener. Is it true that carrots help you see in the dark?
So, Otto, this is a big one. We've all been told it since childhood. Do carrots help us see in the dark, or is this just something our mothers tell us to make us eat more vegetables?
It's a very good question. And to answer it, let's go back. I went all David Attenborough there. I love carrots, personally. Let's talk about the beauty of the humble carrot, first of all, as Uncle Monty once said. They are delightful things and extremely versatile. You can turn them into cake, you can mash them, you can mince them, and you can eat them in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And a fresh, raw carrot plucked straight from a garden is a thing of delight. But
no dig raised bed, as we might say out there in the Real Housewives of Clapton.
They're also a rich source of vitamin A, of course.
Of course.
And vitamin A does indeed, well, it's good for you, isn't it? It's good for your eye health and good for your general health also. But do they help you see in the dark? Well, as I say, let's go back to 1940. The phony war is over and the actual war has begun. And rationing has come with it. As a result, food is scarce, but not carrots.
This is one thing we do know about. Dig for victory, plenty of carrots.
Plenty of carrots, yeah. If you want a carrot, you're all right. If you don't like carrots, you're in trouble. But plenty of carrots around. So the War Office started to encourage people to eat carrots. And Leaflet 2, put out by the War Office, told Britons at the same time that the motto for safety will be keep it dark. Because, of course, with German bombers flying overhead, they wanted to impose a total blackout so that the Luftwaffe, who flew at night because it was safer for them, wouldn't be able to find targets to hit on the ground. So as we all know, anybody who's ever watched Dad's Army or any war movie knows that air wardens went out, go, put that light out, and all that kind of thing, and flashing their torches.
Bill Pertwee in the case of Dad.
Bill Pertwee, brilliantly in Dad's Army. Actually, in the process, thousands of people were killed because if you switch off all the lights, black out all the street lights, turn off all the lights in the cars and buses and trams, and if you black out a city entirely, darkness descends. It's a great time to be a stargazer, but it's not a great time to be a pedestrian. So between September 1939 and 1941, thousands and thousands of people were run over in the streets of our great cities. In fact,
Nightmare.
More people were killed on the roads in 1941 than in any other single year in the history of the automobile.
Wow.
By quite a significant margin. In September 1939 alone, 1,130 British people were killed. And that's before the phony war was even over. That's September 1939. That's right at the start of the war.
Wow.
Not a bomb had fallen on a city and 1,130 people had been killed.
Are you saying that this was what encouraged carrot culture in the war years?
It certainly led to it because the idea that carrots could help you see in the dark, plus the factor that carrots were around in vast quantities and were rich in vitamin A, led the boffins at the War Office to dream up a scheme whereby they would encourage everybody to believe that if you ate lots of carrots, it would be good for your sight. Another thing which is often missed is that domestic accidents also, well, not went through the roof, fell down the stairs. because everybody had switched their lights off, so everybody was tripping over everything. I mean, it was an absolute disaster and carnage, cars crashing left, right and centre. Things only improved slightly when petrol rationing led to people not being able to drive so much. So you only had professional drivers on the roads from like 1941 onwards. Enter, stage left, the hero of the hour, who was called Cat's Eyes Cunningham, John Cat's Eyes Cunningham. John Cat's Eyes Cunningham was one of the few, that breed of great British RAF fighter pilots that included Douglas Bader, my own personal favourite Ian Gleed, and John Cat's Eyes Cunningham. And I think we've discussed this before on the show. In the RAF at the time, the War Office and the Ministry of Information taught these people out almost like they were members of boy bands. So everybody had their favourite fighter pilots. You know, like you'd have Robbie Williams or Harry Styles or something. You'd have John Cat's Eyes Cunningham or Douglas Bader. And they printed cigarette cards and they promoted them in the Daily Mail and they had all these gushing things. Cat's Eyes Cunningham was called Cat's Eyes Cunningham because he was a fighter pilot after the Battle of Britain. So in the period of the Blitz, which followed, and became notorious for shooting down Luftwaffe bombers in the middle of the night. How was he managing to do it, ladies and gentlemen? Yeah, what magical skill? Well, carrots. Yeah.
So
Cat's Eyes Cunningham put his skill in
it was a
the air.
propaganda campaign as well, wasn't it? To sort of big him up so the Germans would be filled with fear.
Because these carrot-eating Bugs Bunny-type RAF pilots who went around shooting people down at night. Now, I hate to break the myths of childhood here, but in fact, his eyesight had all to do with carrots and everything to do with the boffins at RAF Bawdsey on the Suffolk coast.
Right.
Where they were developing airborne interception radar from the late 1930s onwards and erected large towers. Now, I know those towers well, John, because I'm going to let you in on a little bit of biographical detail here.
Go on. We love this.
Back in the early 1990s, I was trying to make a living in theatre, so I was starving in my bedsit. And
living on carrots.
Living on carrots. I couldn't even afford carrots, but I could always afford cigarettes and alcohol. I never quite worked that one out. I couldn't afford the rent or anything else, but I could not go night. Anyway.
The feckless poor.
Very
we know.
strange, yes. Anyway, to that end, somebody I knew happened to be setting up an international school at RAF Bawdsey in Suffolk. And they'd bought the RAF base, and I lived at RAF Bawdsey for a year in a defunct sentry box. That's the side angle. That's a slight side angle. The towers that they set up at RAF Bawdsey.
You did have electric light in your...
I did, yes. And the dog lived next door. Actually, it was pretty much like a feral child. The airborne interception radar system at Bawdsey was the first airborne raid interception system in the world, and it allowed pilots to fly at night, look at radar and to shoot the Luftwaffe down.
Yeah, amazing.
And that at the time could not be revealed because it was an official secret. So they dreamt up this notion that RAF pilots were eating carrots, and incredibly, into all of our childhoods, people continue to believe it.
There is a bit of truth in there, isn't there, with vitamin A? But my understanding of it is that night vision, it's not that it is improved, it's that sometimes if you have vitamin A deficiency, you get night blindness because you haven't got enough. I think it's rhodopsin or whatever you need, which is in vitamin A, which is in carrots. But it's not like if you eat lots and lots, you suddenly have incredible kind of clearer night. You just night vision's a real thing. I mean, if you do go, as I did recently, I wrote about it in Byline, walked a mile into dark woodland without any natural light at all. It is astonishing how quickly your eyes do adapt to what's around you.
I love the deep darkness. It's really hard to find anywhere, particularly in Europe.
Yeah, it is.
Actually, in my youth, when I travelled around Southeast Asia, I remember being Kalimantan, which is, of course, on the island of Borneo, right in the depths of the jungle, no light pollution at all. And you looked up and you could see the entire Milky Way, but not in the way that you see it in Southern Europe or even in parts of Africa or the Maldives. Just this bright thing.
It feels much closer, weirdly closer, doesn't it? I've done that in the middle of the Pacific, looking up. After a while, it's almost like an illusion. You almost feel like you were part of the sky.
It's incredible.
It's incredible. There's no light at all.
Bring back the blackout, you see? Bring back World War II.
And so Cat's Eye, a bit of British propaganda.
There are, of course, some great posters from the eras, which I can't show you because this is a podcast.
Indeed.
But there are great pictures from the era trying to promote this idea. But what I love about it is that, I mean, I don't love it. It's slightly sad in a way, but people are gullible. I mean, how could anybody believe that the guy was flying around the sky? It's a different age, you see. But even today, maybe people would believe it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, people believe different things, don't they? They believe that taking a spoonful of powdered lion's mane fungi in their tea, makes them better able to concentrate. And maybe it does. I don't know.
Never tried.
Haven't seen the scientific evidence for it. I do know that they were really pushing carrots quite hard. And one of the things they tried to
Carrot pushers.
Apparently in Portugal, and forgive me as I don't know this as a fact, but apparently they make quite a delicious jam out of carrots in Portugal. And they were, whichever Ministry of Information or whichever it was, who were trying to kind of get carrot madness to take root, excuse the pun, would put recipes up like carrot jam, which never took off. Maybe.
I mean, I wouldn't have it, would you?
Not Seville marmalade. orange marmalade on offer. Probably not. I haven't tried it. It might be delicious.
Poor old John Cunningham had a bit of a miserable end.
Did he?
It's a reminder of, nowadays, anybody who sort of was in a Girl Guides uniform in the Second World War is lauded as a sort of hero and, our boys and girls doing their bit and whatever. Cunningham, despite being this, just like many of those amazing pilots of the Second World War, they were diminished down until really it was just the likes of Douglas Bader that were remembered and everybody else was forgotten. Cunningham was one of those people who during the 1980s thought that he would retire and put all of his money into Lloyd's. I mean, he became a Lloyd's name. Only to lose literally everything in the crash in whatever it was, 1987. So it was a bit of a bittersweet end, which is a pity because not only did he protect this nation from the egregious Nazi encroachment, but also he gave us a cracking myth.
Apparently, if you eat too many carrots, it will
turn you orange.
The carotene will start to.
Is that true?
Yeah, that's what I've heard. That's maybe another
another day.
Yeah.
The idea that carrots grant night vision is a bit of a myth. But it's not entirely off the mark. Here's the truth. Carrots are rich in beta-carotene, which is converted by the body into vitamin A. Vitamin A is essential for healthy vision, especially in low light conditions. If you have a vitamin A deficiency, you may experience night blindness. Eating carrots can help correct this deficiency. However, for someone with normal vitamin A levels, carrots won't give you superhuman night vision or the ability to see in complete darkness.
Impeccable answer, AI Joe, with which I completely concur.
Yes, it's brilliant. I think we'd just give up and just put AI Joe. We'll keep the podcast a lot shorter. The listeners can learn everything without us muttering about everything.
I don't know whether it's because it's being kind of trained on previous episodes of the podcast, but I feel AI Joe's beginning to develop a little bit of a personality, a little bit of spirit there. But we need to work out what we think this is then. Is it the full utter bollocks, or is it just an urban myth?
I mean, on the other hand, you see, some lies do serve a purpose. And on the other hand, when my kids were born, my wife and I had a very long discussion about this. One of the few things we've ever actually fully agreed on. We both agreed that we would not make food an issue. And by that, we both agreed that we would never say to the kids, you've got to eat your carrots or you've got to eat your broccoli. As a result, my children never really had a problem with eating vegetables. Top parenting tip.
Being forced to eat anything is always a disaster.
Of course. We might return to the subject of food you were forced to eat as a child in even more bollocks at the end of our discussion. But I think it's just bollocks. I don't think it's utter bollocks. I think it's bollocks.
And the conclusion is bollocks.
Do we have a question from the audience this week, John?
I don't know. I think we might have. Let's ask AI Joe.
My question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
So a little bit of character development there from AI Joe.
Please God, no.
I don't have any other vegetable-based puns, so
just that 24-carat gold. Wonder one.
It's the eternal question, isn't it? I mean, you wish you had Toby Young here to ask him, really. But, as you know, I know absolutely nothing about this. Therefore, I feel, as a 21st century person, that I'm an expert on the matter and I'm going to give my opinion.
Go on, then.
Surely the chicken had to come before the egg.
Well, it depends what come means in this context, Otto, doesn't it? Let's say the concept, let's say there is a thing that is a chicken, and let's say there is a thing that is an egg. You could argue, not saying I'm going to, but you could argue that eggs as a form of reproduction evolved long before the chicken itself. The chicken, as we know, is an avian, and although avians have been around for a long time, we're pretty sure that reptiles from which they branched out from a common ancestor, that eggs were being laid by those common ancestors before birds had evolved. We don't.
We've answered it.
Do we know that dinosaurs laid eggs? Yeah, we do, because we found fossilized eggs.
Yeah.
So I think there were eggs before there were chickens. So if that answers
It's a
Joe's
pretty
question,
good answer. It's a pretty good answer.
But I think the more interesting thing about dinosaurs, speculation about dinosaurs, as you know, there's been a lot of really interesting research in the last 20 years. And the vision of dinosaurs that probably you and I grew up with has now been superseded by a much more interesting proposition that a lot of them seem to be feathered, for a start. And if they were feathered and if they were laying eggs, is it possible that they reproduced using the cloacal kiss? Do you know what the cloacal kiss is?
I feel sure you're going to tell me.
Well, birds, as you know, most of them don't have external genitalia. They have a single hole through which everything happens, the cloaca. Of course, you would remember this from your Latin days, from the Roman for sewer. But when birds, if you notice when chickens make other chickens, when they mate, like most birds, they press their two cloaca together and the sperm is transformed that way. So there's been a lot of speculation as to, that's how dinosaurs reproduced. And nobody will ever know, but it seems likely.
God.
I mean, pretty hard to imagine a huge, well, of course, Brontosaurus isn't a real, that doesn't exist anymore. But imagine even a Tyrannosaurus or a Triceratops, that kind of size of multiple tons of animal trying to reproduce it all. Anyway, mild speculation.
I can't believe they cancelled the Brontosaurus.
Yeah, afraid it did.
Yes, ultimate cancelling.
It turned out to be just a kind of amalgam of other dinosaurs.
Oh, did it?
Yeah.
So, having destroyed your childhood myths of Romulus, Remus, carrots helping you to see in the dark, Tarzan,
Brontosauruses,
and most of all, Brontosauruses, which I'm actually sitting here feeling quite upset about.
You've still got the Stegosaurus to keep you warm.
It's not the same, is it? There's something very comforting about the Brontosaurus. Yeah. Until about 3 minutes ago. Anyway, if you want to join us for even more bollocks, please subscribe at bylineaudio.com.
That's bylineaudio.com.
And join us for even more bollocks.
That's bylineaudio.com. This has been a Byline Audio production in association with Unbound. Produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. And for even more bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.